Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into something pretty crucial today. It's the whole global race for AI dominance, and we always hear about the big tech companies battling it out, but this is bigger. This is about countries going head to head, and the stakes are, well, they're massive. We know you guys want to get up to speed on these big issues quickly, but also thoroughly, and that's what we aim to do here.
Right. To get to the bottom of this, we're looking at a really interesting discussion by a security PhD, and they've kind of laid out how all these national interests are getting tangled up with the AI revolution. I mean, they touch on everything:
Yeah.
economic power, digital sovereignty, even the semiconductor industry, which is a huge bottleneck right now.
Yeah, and we're going to unpack all of that for you. Basically, why are countries so obsessed with AI? What are the potential consequences? So let's just jump right in. Why is AI such a big deal for nations right now?
Well, the most obvious factor, the one that everyone immediately thinks of, is the military implications. The possibility of smarter drones, better cyber weapons, that kind of thing. And yeah, those are serious concerns. It gives countries a huge strategic advantage. You could take away all the economic arguments, and nations would still be fighting tooth and nail over AI just for the military applications.
It's not even just about having fancier weapons, right? It's about like completely changing the whole strategic game. But the economic side of this is obviously gigantic too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you see that New York Times estimate of AI adding like $4.4 trillion to the global economy every year. That's something like 4% of the entire world's GDP right now. It shows you the scale of the opportunity. But, and this is key, these benefits aren't going to be spread out evenly. Some countries are in a much better position to capitalize on AI than others. Just imagine countries that control key AI tech. They could use that economic power to swing trade deals, influence international policy.
Mhm.
It creates a whole new set of dependencies.
So it becomes this kind of winner-take-all situation. Why is AI development so skewed like that? What makes it that way?
It all comes down to the resources needed to build these advanced AI models. We're talking immense computing power, tons of data. Most players simply don't have the resources to even get in the game. Smaller companies, even some entire countries. Now, once you do have a trained AI model, using it, that's called inference, becomes super cheap and easy. So you have this huge upfront investment, then a really low cost to actually use it.
Yeah.
And that just makes the winner-take-all dynamic even more extreme.
So you absolutely have to be in it to win it at the very highest level. And if you are, you get this huge advantage that lasts a long time. The source we're looking at even compares it to like the pharmaceutical industry. How does that work?
Oh, that's a great comparison. Think about it. You have these pharmaceutical companies spending billions on research and development. Then the actual manufacturing of the drug is relatively cheap. And the legal systems, especially in certain parts of the world, are designed to protect those initial R&D costs. It
Yeah.
gives the big pharma companies huge control. And we might see something very similar happen with AI. Like, what kind of legal frameworks will pop up to protect AI developers? How will governments regulate AI development and its use? It could end up looking a lot like drug approvals, which would solidify the power of the early leaders even more.
Yeah, it seems like a few powerful nations could end up holding all the cards. And then there's this whole other consequence of AI we haven't even touched on yet, mass job displacement, automation.
Yeah, that's a big one. It raises this huge question about the future of work, the future of our economic systems.
Hmm.
And sure, there's some talk about things like universal basic income, as a safety net for people who lose their jobs to automation. But honestly, most countries seem way more focused on winning the AI race than on figuring out the societal consequences. They want to make sure their own companies and economies are at the front of the pack, not really worried about global job losses.
And they're doing all they can to attract and support their tech companies to get there.
Absolutely. We're seeing governments throwing everything they've got at tech companies. Deregulation, tougher cybersecurity, big tax breaks, direct financial incentives, you name it. That whole bidding war over Amazon's HQ2 a few years back, that's a perfect example. It shows you just how fiercely these regions are competing to become the home of these tech giants.
Like a modern day race to be the technological superpower. And the prize is economic growth, strategic advantage, the whole nine yards. And as these tech companies get bigger and more important, their relationship with governments has to change too, right?
Yeah, there's a definite power shift happening. As tech companies become essential for economic growth and even national security, they have a lot more leverage with governments. What they want, what they need, starts to shape policy decisions more and more.
And this whole nationalistic competition seems to be changing how globalization works. The source we're looking at suggests we're moving away from this idea of a completely open, interconnected world.
That's one of the key takeaways here. We're seeing a shift away from the kind of globalization we've had for the last few decades, the US-led system. Countries are starting to realize that these big global supply chains are vulnerable. They're worried about being too reliant on other countries for critical technologies.
I mean, the pandemic and the war in Ukraine really exposed those vulnerabilities, didn't they? Suddenly, we couldn't take access to all these essential things for granted anymore.
Exactly. It showed everyone just how fragile these global supply chains are, especially when you're relying on a handful of producers for essential stuff. And naturally, this thinking has spilled over into AI. Countries want to make sure they can build their own AI systems, that they're not dependent on anyone else.
And it's not just about having a stable supply of AI itself. The discussion also brings up the issue of bias. Bias in the data used to train these AIs.
That's a really important point. We're realizing that the data used to train AI models carries the biases of its origins. So if a country relies on AI models developed somewhere else, they might be importing ways of thinking, priorities that don't really match their own. You know that anecdote about European friends thinking ChatGPT sounded American? It's like the AI has this cultural fingerprint based on the data it was trained on.
So this push for, what's it called, digital sovereignty, it's leading to some real action from countries.
Absolutely. We're seeing all kinds of measures to protect data and build up domestic tech capabilities. The EU's GDPR, that's a big one. It affects companies way beyond Europe. It's a clear example of a region saying, hey, we're going to control our citizens' data, even if it's being handled by companies based elsewhere. And Canada has rules that stop public institutions from being forced to use foreign-hosted services for sensitive data. It's all part of this trend.
And then there's China. They've set some really ambitious goals with that Made in China 2025 plan.
Oh, yeah. China wants to be totally self-sufficient in technology by 2025. It's incredibly ambitious. Now, they still rely on global supply chains for some raw materials, but when it comes to AI, they've got some advantages.
Like their approach to individual rights and privacy, it lets them roll out technologies like facial recognition really quickly and collect tons of data. Those examples from Shanghai are pretty eye-opening.
They are. I mean, they've got cameras everywhere tracking everything from traffic violations to jaywalking. They even display people's personal information on public screens. It's a level of data collection that would be really hard to imagine in many other parts of the world. But it gives them this huge edge in terms of building the massive data sets needed to train these advanced AI models.
And meanwhile, the EU has its own set of challenges in this whole AI race.
Right. The EU is worried about becoming too dependent on American AI tech, and they're having trouble attracting and keeping top AI talent. Salaries are often lower, and there aren't as many cutting-edge research opportunities compared to North America. This brain drain is a big problem for their AI ambitions.
It's interesting to look at all this in a historical context.
Yeah.
The U.S. came out of World War II as the dominant global power, and at first they were all about globalization.
Exactly. After World War II, the U.S. was the leader, both economically and militarily. And they pushed for this interconnected global marketplace with themselves right at the center. Technological independence wasn't a big concern because this system worked for them, and they were driving most of the innovation anyway. U.S. universities were thriving. They attracted the best minds from around the world because they had the funding and the opportunities for groundbreaking research.
But that way of thinking has definitely changed over time, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah. The U.S. started seeing industries moving overseas, they tightened immigration policies, and other countries started catching up technologically really fast. So in recent years, the U.S. has become more protectionist. They're focused on maintaining their own technological edge.
Which brings us to what the discussion calls the semiconductor Cold War. I think for a lot of people, semiconductors are this kind of abstract thing, but they're the foundation of everything in AI, right?
The bedrock, absolutely. And the key player in this Cold War is the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC. Most people haven't heard of it, but as our source points out, it's the 10th largest company in the world by market cap. They're not a consumer-facing brand. They operate behind the scenes, making the advanced chips that power, well, everything. Your phone, the most sophisticated AI systems, the servers running giant companies like Apple, NVIDIA, AMD. It's all built on TSMC chips.
And they basically have a monopoly on these advanced chips, something like 90% market share. It's a huge amount of power concentrated in one company.
It is. And it shows how much the industry has changed. It used to be that the big players, companies like IBM, Texas Instruments, they did everything in-house, designed and manufactured their own chips. But as chips got more and more complex, more expensive to develop, companies started specializing. Some focused on design, others on manufacturing.
Yeah, the story of Intel and AMD is a great example of that. AMD started outsourcing their manufacturing to TSMC, and it seems like that gave them an edge over Intel.
Exactly. Intel, they still make their own chips, but they had a lot of trouble moving to the newer manufacturing processes. AMD, by partnering with TSMC, who had the expertise and the scale from serving the entire global market, they were able to make those technological jumps more smoothly. Of course, AMD's chip designs themselves were also really innovative, so that helped too.
And the founding of TSMC is a fascinating story in itself. It was started by this American semiconductor veteran who basically created the entire industry in Taiwan.
And what's really remarkable is that Taiwan wasn't a tech hub back then. It was this one guy's vision and determination that created a company that now accounts for something like 15% of Taiwan's entire GDP.
And the amount they invest in R&D is mind-blowing. 5% of Taiwan's GDP in a single year just to build new factories, those fabs.
Yeah, that shows you how strategically important this industry is for Taiwan. TSMC is expanding, building new fabs in the US, Germany, Japan, but those are still just a small part of their overall manufacturing capacity. Taiwan's location, being close to China for assembly and shipping, that's been a big advantage for them. But with all the tension between the US and China, it's not clear how that's going to play out in the long run.
And TSMC is way ahead of everyone else technologically. Only Samsung and Intel are even close to making the same kind of advanced chips. And they're constantly pushing the boundaries with these nanometer advancements. Can you break that down a little bit? What does that even mean?
Basically, nanometers are these tiny, tiny measurements, 1/1000th of a meter. And the smaller you can go, the more transistors you can fit on a single chip. More transistors means more processing power, better energy efficiency, and ultimately the ability to handle the incredibly complex calculations needed for advanced AI. So this race to shrink the nanometer size, going from 5 nm to 3 nm, with TSMC already working on 2 nm, it shows you just how intense the innovation is in this field.
So obviously, all of this makes countries that aren't close allies with Taiwan or South Korea pretty nervous, especially China. They need these chips, and they're falling behind.
Exactly. And the U.S. has already taken steps to limit China's access to this tech. The biggest move was blocking the sale of EUV lithography machines to China. EUV stands for extreme ultraviolet lithography. It's this super advanced technology, and you need it to make the most cutting-edge chips, the 5 mm and smaller ones. And there's only one company in the Netherlands that makes these EUV machines, so that's a major bottleneck.
But the source we're looking at mentions that Chinese chip makers have been making some unexpected progress.
Yeah, it was pretty surprising. SMIC, a Chinese chip maker that's closely linked to the military, they managed to produce 7 mm chips without anyone knowing. It came out because someone analyzed the chips in some Bitcoin mining equipment. That definitely raised some eyebrows. It means that China might be further along in advanced chip manufacturing than we thought, even with all the restrictions in place.
And this plays right into the U.S.'s fears about Taiwan. They're worried that China might invade, and then all that crucial chip-making expertise would be in their hands.
It's a huge geopolitical concern. The U.S. knows that having so much of the world's advanced chip manufacturing concentrated in Taiwan, right next to a potential adversary, is a huge risk.
And that's why the U.S. took the step of officially classifying microchip manufacturing as critical to national security.
That happened in late 2022, and it was a big deal. It showed that the U.S. was really serious about this. And they didn't stop there. They actually expanded the rules that prevent Americans from working for foreign militaries. They broadened it to include any substantial contribution to microchip development in countries like China.
Which led to that really dramatic situation for American engineers and managers working at Chinese chip companies.
Yeah, the U.S. government basically gave them an ultimatum. They said, you have to choose. Give up your U.S. citizenship or quit your job in the Chinese chip industry. And they were serious. They threatened legal action. It led to a ton of resignations, and it was a big setback for China's plans to build up their chip-making industry. It shows that the U.S. is not playing around anymore. They've taken a clear side in this tech competition.
So to sum it all up, what we're seeing is this fierce global competition over AI, driven by the need for better weapons and the potential for huge economic gains.
And this competition is pushing countries to become more self-sufficient in technology. They want to control their own data, build their own AI systems, and make sure they have access to the essential components, like those advanced semiconductors.
It's led to what some people are calling a semiconductor Cold War, where control over chip manufacturing, especially TSMC's dominance, has become the central point of geopolitical tension. It's a key battleground in the overall fight for AI supremacy.
It all ties together. The drive to be the leader in AI is having these huge ripple effects on global politics, on trade, on how technology develops.
So here's something to think about. We have this intense competition between nations, and we know that semiconductor technology is essential to all of this. Given how much is at stake and how quickly things are changing, what kind of unexpected things might happen, what new alliances might form, what disruptions might we see in this race for AI dominance, and how will all of this impact our lives and the stability of the world in ways we can't even predict right now? That's something to chew on.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.